All right, let's just jump right in. Today in this explainer, we are digging into the anatomy of a political ground game. We've got our hands on a fascinating organizing transcript, a strategy call the participants actually refer to as Boot Camp 12. We're going to strictly use this source to see exactly how a specific political faction is trying to take these really high-level economic theories and translate them into direct grassroots action for the upcoming elections. Let's break down the whole shebang. So here's the roadmap for where we're headed. We'll start with the economic revolution thesis, then look at rejecting the invisible hand. Dive into how the American system returns, see how they're testing strategy in Texas, and finally wrap up with the grassroots identity shift.
Okay, starting right off with Section 1, the economic revolution thesis.
Now, the organizers here, they don't just frame their movement as your typical list of policy platforms. No, they're pitching a complete replacement of the current economic system. It's literally a clash of two entirely different worldviews. On one side, you have what they call the old system. They describe this as consumption-driven, globalist, and heavily reliant on the invisible hand of the free market, which they argue has completely failed us. Then, on the flip side, you've got the new system. This is a production-first model entirely focused on economic sovereignty and strategic independence. So they are telling their organizers on this call that they are attempting nothing short of a true economic revolution.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 2, rejecting the invisible hand. To really wrap our heads around this new system, we have to look at how heavily these organizers rely on a recent speech by Scott Bessent at the Reagan Economic Forum. Notice how they use his exact words to aggressively critique past trade policies. Bessent says, "We assumed the rules-based system would discipline these behaviors only to find that it accommodated them." The organizers are using this to explicitly reject Adam Smith's invisible hand. They're arguing that a blind faith in free trade didn't bring about some kind of global harmony. Instead, it actually accommodated adversaries and ended up gutting American industry. And building on that critique, the source claims that the deindustrialization of the U.S. wasn't just an accident. It wasn't some unavoidable force of nature. They are organizing around this core idea that it was a deliberate policy choice spanning decades. They map out this timeline starting back in 1979 when the dollar was taken off the gold reserve standard. Then they moved through 1994, arguing NAFTA really accelerated outsourcing, right up to the massive financial system blowout in 2008. The goal here is to teach their grassroots members to view all these events as a deliberate dismantling of American manufacturing, something they believe has to be reversed right now. The absolute crux of their economic critique is captured right here in another quote from Bessent: "We measured abundance at the checkout counter rather than the factory gate." The organizers emphasize this to highlight how, in their view, America dangerously reduced economics down to just cheap consumption. They're making the case that politicians sold the public on a myth, that as long as you could get cheap goods at the big box store, it didn't really matter if factories in Michigan or Ohio were going dark. It perfectly encapsulates their belief that true economic health is measured by what a country actually produces, not just what it consumes. So how do they propose fixing it? That brings us to Section 3, the American system returns. Here is their proposed solution. This is the intellectual foundation they're actively trying to resurrect, which they're calling the American system. It's heavily inspired by Alexander Hamilton, and they even point out that this specific term was recently used over at Davos to push back against globalist models. This system prioritizes the productive powers of labor, robust domestic manufacturing, and strict national economic sovereignty. And they stress, this isn't just about making a buck. They firmly believe economic security is national security. The argument is pretty simple. A nation that can't manufacture its own basic needs is a nation gradually giving up its sovereignty to others. The organizers then drop this powerful quote to really underscore their fundamental belief about wealth. Productive capacity is power. They are arguing that a nation's true security doesn't live in stock market indices. It lives in a reservoir of practical capability. They're literally talking about the engineers, the welders, the tool and die makers, the plant managers, the people who know how to solve physical problems right there on the factory floor. They want their organizers to go out and convince voters that America desperately needs to recover its confidence as a nation that actually builds things. All right, let's transition from theory to practice with Section 4, testing strategy in Texas. So the organizers claim this specific ideology is already winning out there on the actual political battlefield in Texas. On the call, they report a massive turnout from the MAGA base. They frame Ken Paxton's runoff victory over a sitting senator as this monumental win against the Republican establishment, specifically calling it a rejection of the old Bush machine. But hey, it's not just the incumbents. They also highlight the victory of Alex Hale. He's a 27-year-old who actually founded an Alexander Hamilton Club back at Baylor University and just won a really tough congressional runoff. To the folks on this call, this is hard evidence that their American system messaging is absolutely resonating. And then the organizers highlight a very specific, singular data point about Paxton, the number 2. Back in 2023, Ken Paxton was one of only 2 politicians physically present at Donald Trump's 2024 campaign announcement. They emphasized this number to show their organizers a clear pattern. Early, unwavering loyalty is exactly what is being rewarded right now by voters who are buying into this new system.
Which takes us to our final part, Section 5, Grassroots Identity Shift.
This brings us to the deepest, most psychological goal of this entire organizing call. And honestly, it goes way beyond just handing out flyers. The lead organizer constantly stresses that just throwing facts and statistics at people, that's not going to win over an apathetic voter. Instead, they are attempting a full-on intervention on a voter's fundamental identity. Step 1 is getting voters to actively reject the identity of being a victim or a passive consumer trapped in some rigged global system. Then, step 2 is empowering them to embrace the identity of a producer, someone who actually has command over the direction of their own life. They are treating the election as a very literal battle over self-perception.
And we can actually see this ground game in action through a report from an organizer named Mark out in Placer County, California. They aren't just sitting around theorizing on the internet. Mark details how they're taking these high-level Hamiltonian concepts directly to the streets. They've got an 18-foot trailer, they're setting up at 15 to 17 different community fairs, and they're handing out leaflets to educate voters face-to-face. And here's the kicker. Even in a heavily Democratic state like California, they report finding eager crowds, like 5 to 7 people deep, who are absolutely hungry for this specific message.
We're going to wrap up this explainer with a final, really critical question for you to consider. The source transcript reveals a highly coordinated, ideologically driven movement that links these huge global trade critiques and Hamiltonian economics straight to local grassroots activism. So, will this incredibly ambitious attempt to rewrite political psychology, to literally change a voter's identity from a passive consumer to an active producer, actually succeed in reshaping the broader electoral landscape? Ultimately, that is the true test of Bootcamp 12 strategy. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep your eyes on how these concepts play out on the ground.